The wind that afternoon in Hollow Bend wasn't the gentle kind. It was the sort that scraped across the skin and carried the smell of dust and dry timber, as if the whole town had been baked in the same sun for too many years. The depot was hardly more than a weathered shed with a name painted in fading letters, its bench warped from rain and heat. That's where she stood, Margaret Elsum, her trunk planted beside her boots like a stubborn promise she wasn't sure she could keep. The train that had carried her here was already a memory, its whistle gone, its smoke fading into the far hills, leaving her in a silence that felt both too heavy and too hollow. She'd imagined an arrival. She'd imagined a fan waiting, hat in hand, face lit with recognition, a voice calling her name. That's how it was supposed to go when a woman traveled across states for a mail-order marriage. But the platform was empty. There was no greeting, no explanation, just the hard fact that no one had come. And when the truth settled in, it didn't hit like a sharp blow. It spread slow, like water soaking into cloth, until every part of her felt heavier. Margaret wasn't a stranger to disappointment, but this had a sting all its own. She had dressed for the occasion, her best gloves, her traveling hat pinned just right, her dress brushed and mended where it needed to be. Now those choices felt almost foolish, as if she had been playing a role in a play no one else cared to watch. The gloves were too warm. The brim of her hat shielded her eyes from the sun, but not from the ache that sat just behind them. The wind curled around her skirt, tugged at her shawl, whispered through the brittle grass beyond the tracks. Hollow Bend wasn't the kind of place to notice a lone woman for long. The station master had tipped his hat once and gone back to his ledger, the only acknowledgement she'd been given since stepping off the train. Out here, you either belonged or you didn't, and right now, she stood firmly in the second category. But fate has a way of taking the long road, and sometimes it sends the right soul down it at the right time. She heard the sound before she saw him, the slow creak of wagon wheels rolling over dry earth, the steady clop of hooves in no hurry at all. The wagon came into view from the bend in the road, boards worn gray and silver, harness leather darkened by use. The man driving it sat straight, his shoulders broad, his hat brim shadowing his face. He wasn't scanning the depot like a man searching for someone he was just passing through. When he pulled up alongside the platform, his gaze settled on her. Not quick, not sharp, just steady, like he had the patience to take the full measure of a thing before speaking. "You waiting on someone?" he asked, voice low and even. "I was," Margaret said, her hand tightening on the trunk handle. She didn't offer more. His eyes shifted down the track, then back to her. "Train's gone. Sun'll be down in a few hours." There was no urgency in his tone, just a fact, plain as the dust in the air. She studied him in that moment, tall, probably in his 40s, with the look of a man who'd worked enough land to know what it could take from you. He didn't look like the kind who offered charity for sport, nor the kind who took advantage for the sake of it. "I've got a ranch about 5 miles out," he said, "if you need a place to get your bearings." The offer sat between them like an unlit lantern. She could hear her own caution, the voice that had kept her safe more than once, asking what kind of man invites a stranger home. But there was no push in him, no coaxing, only a stillness that felt, strangely, like a choice rather than a trap. "What's your name?" she asked. "Thomas Cowan," he replied. "Yours?" "Margaret Elsum." He nodded once, like he was committing it to memory. "Well, Miss Elsum, it's a long walk to anywhere from here. You're welcome to ride along." The trunk was heavier than she remembered when she lifted it. He stepped down without being asked, took it from her, and set it in the wagon bed with an ease that suggested he wasn't in the habit of making a production out of simple kindness. When he offered his hand to help her up, she hesitated, not from mistrust exactly, but from a stubborn wish to prove she could stand on her own. Still, she took it. His hand was warm, steady, the kind of hold that didn't tell you where to go, but let you know you'd be steady when you got there. As the wagon rolled forward, the depot fell away behind them. Neither spoke at first. The sound of the wheels and the rhythm of the horses filled the space where conversation might have been. And for the first time since stepping off the train, Margaret found she didn't mind the quiet. The road ahead stretched wide under a sky painted gold by the lowering sun. She didn't know if this was the start of something or just a place to rest, before moving on. But it was forward. And that was enough. And friends, if you're still with me in this story, if you felt that kind of silence, that kind of unexpected turn in the road, then you know how quickly a life can change with nothing more than a stranger's steady gaze and a choice to step forward. If you want to hear what happens next, how this dust-bitten depot moment turns into something neither of them could have predicted, make sure you like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and follow the channel so you don't miss the rest. Every story deserves someone to witness it, and I'd like you to be here for all of it. The way Thomas came toward her wasn't hurried, and it wasn't careless. It was the kind of movement that slowed the space around it, as if the air itself decided there was no need to rush. His boots made no more sound than necessary on the weathered boards of the depot platform, his shadow stretching long in the late afternoon light. Margaret felt her shoulders stiffen on instinct. A man approaching a woman alone was rarely without some intent, and she'd learned over the years that it paid to read the small things first. The eyes, the set of the jaw, the hands. But there was nothing sharp in his gaze, nothing coiled in his stance. He simply looked at her, the way a man might look at a tree standing out in an empty field, measuring the shape of it, not deciding its worth. He didn't ask what she was doing there or why no one had met her. He didn't prod at the story that hung between her trunk and the empty platform. He just stood there for a breath longer than most would, the reins looped loosely over his arm, and said, "I can take you out to my place, if you need somewhere to be for a while." It wasn't an offer dressed up in pity, and it wasn't a sales pitch for something she didn't want. It was plain, so plain, in fact, that she almost didn't trust it. Her mind tried to fit the words into familiar shapes. Surely there had to be a catch, but her heart told her to look harder. So she did. She studied the lines at the corners of his eyes, the way his fingers rested easy on the leather, the way he didn't shift his weight like a man impatient for her answer. "I don't know you," she said, keeping her voice even. "You don't," he agreed without bristling. "But it's a long walk from here to anywhere, and the sun's not getting higher." Her gaze slid past him to the road beyond. It stretched out empty in both directions, the wind making small rivers of dust that rolled and vanished. She imagined herself hauling that trunk along the roadside, skirt hem gathering every burr between here and town. She imagined the night catching her before she reached a door she could knock on. Margaret wasn't one to lean on a stranger if she could help it. But there was something about the way he left the choice in her hands. No push, no leaning closer, that made the choice possible at all. "What's your name?" she asked. "Thomas Cowan," he said. "Yours?" "Margaret Elsum." He nodded like he'd just marked it down somewhere in his mind. "All right, Miss Elsum, my wagon's right there. You're welcome to ride along or not. Either way, I'll be heading west in about 2 minutes." That was it. No coaxing, no story about how he'd make her life better, no false familiarity, Just a man who'd given her the one thing she'd been denied since stepping off that train, an option. Her trunk handle was rough under her palm as she lifted it. The weight reminded her how far she'd already traveled, and how little good it would do to stand still now. She walked toward the wagon, keeping her eyes on him as she did, half expecting him to shift somehow, to break the spell of that quiet steadiness. But he didn't. He stepped down, took the trunk from her without making it a display of strength, and set it in the bed. Then he offered his hand, not in a way that insisted, but as if to say, "If you want it, it's here." She took it. His grip was warm, steady, the kind you didn't have to brace yourself against. Once she was settled on the seat, he gathered the reins, and the wagon moved forward without another word. The depot shrank behind them, swallowed by distance and dust, until it was just another place she'd been left. Ahead was a road she didn't know, and a man whose patience seemed as much a part of him as the hat on his head. She wasn't sure yet if she'd made the right choice, but she was certain of one thing: it was hers to make. And folks, that's how some stories start. Not with grand speeches or sweeping gestures, but with a single offer given without strings. If you've ever been at a crossroads like that, tired, unsure, scanning the horizon for something that might hold, then you know the weight of it. If you want to see where this road takes Margaret, what she finds at the end of it, and how a quiet offer can change the shape of a life, make sure you like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and follow the channel so you don't miss what's coming next. Sometimes the smallest choices lead to the biggest turns, and you'll want to be here when they do. The wagon rolled steady beneath them, wheels humming against the hard-packed dirt, the sound folding itself into the whisper of dry grass that stretched in every direction. The sun was leaning low, painting the horizon in long strokes of gold and rust, and the air had that end-of-day weight to it, soft but expectant. Thomas didn't speak much, but when he did, it was never to fill the silence. He'd point with a gloved hand to a cut in the land where a creek ran in wetter months, or to a dark line of cottonwoods that marked where the wind usually bent from the west. It wasn't conversation so much as a quiet way of telling her she wasn't lost. Margaret sat straight, trying not to look like she was taking stock of everything, the way his hat brim shadowed most of his face, the faint pull in his left shoulder when he turned the reins, the easy patience with which he let the horses set their own pace. She didn't know him, not truly, but there was something in the way he seemed at home in the emptiness that made her believe he wasn't one to rush. The grassland felt endless, brittle stalks shivering in the breeze like an old hymn humming under its breath. Once or twice, she thought she caught the scent of sage. She kept her hands folded in her lap, fingertips worrying at the hem of her cuff, telling herself she wasn't nervous, just alert. When you'd been sent places before and found doors shut in your face, you learned not to expect much from an arrival. It was nearly full dark before she saw the outline of a house against the sky. Not grand, not new, just there, squared against the wind as if it had been standing watch for a long time. A low barn squatted a short distance off, and a lean line of fencing framed what she guessed was pasture. No lanterns glowed in the windows yet, but smoke drifted from the chimney in a thin, lazy column. When Thomas pulled the wagon to a stop, she climbed down slow, her boots crunching in the dirt. Up close, the house showed its year's paint weathered down to the bare wood in places, a porch that sagged just slightly, shingles darkened from old storms. But it was tended. The steps had been swept clear of leaves, the hinges on the door didn't sag, and the stacked wood near the wall was cut uniform and neat. Inside, the air was warm with the scent of wood smoke and something faintly sweet, maybe from the cedar he'd burned earlier. Margaret's eyes swept the room in one quiet turn, The table was sturdy but bare. Shelves lined with jars of preserves and sacks of flour were arranged without fuss, every one within easy reach. There was a chair angled near the hearth that looked like it had been sat in a long time, its arms worn smooth by the weight of hands. But there was no lace curtain softening the window, no quilt draped over the back of a chair, no little jars of wildflowers set out just to make the place look kinder. The absence spoke as loud as anything else in the room. This was a space kept by one person, and one person only. A man who had learned to keep things running without the extra touches. Thomas set her trunk just inside the door and stepped back, almost as if to give her space to see it for herself. He didn't rush to make it sound like more than it was. "Supper's not much," he said simply, "but it's warm." She nodded, grateful for the warmth and the way he didn't pretend the place was something it wasn't. She could feel the quiet here, not the uneasy kind that waits to be broken, but the kind that's been lived in for years. Still, underneath it all was something she couldn't quite name. Not loneliness exactly, but the shadow of it. The air held a stillness that felt like grief settled in, like it had taken a seat years ago and never fully left. She didn't ask about it, not that night. She just followed him toward the kitchen, the floorboards creaking under their steps, thinking that maybe this wasn't a house in need of a woman's touch, so much as it was a house that had learned to keep going without one. And maybe, just maybe, there was room in that for her to breathe. The days in Hollow Bend didn't start with words. They began with the scrape of chair legs on the floor, the faint scent of coffee drifting through the air, and the low clink of dishes as Margaret moved about the kitchen. Thomas would already be outside by then, the door clicking shut behind him as he headed toward the barn, his boots making that steady, unhurried sound on the packed dirt. It wasn't a house that needed to announce itself in the morning. It just eased awake. She learned the rhythm quickly, without either of them having to set it down in rules. The stove got lit before the sun broke the horizon. The bread dough was kneaded, while the sky was still soft with that pre-dawn gray. By the time Thomas came in for his first cup, the table would be set. Nothing fancy, just biscuits, eggs, and whatever fruit she'd managed to bring in from the garden. He'd tip his hat toward her in a quiet thank you, the corners of his mouth lifting just slightly, and then they'd eat without rush. There were no expectations spoken out loud. Margaret didn't ask where he went after breakfast, and he didn't ask what she planned to do with her day. Still, their work bent toward each other without them meaning to. While he mended fence lines under the hard glare of the noon sun, she weeded the garden rows until the skin on her arms warmed and her skirt hem picked up the dust. When he came in with tools slung over his shoulder, she'd already swept the porch, and the scent of stew or roast would be drifting out the open windows. Sometimes they crossed paths in the yard. He'd nod toward the fence she'd leaned a rake against, and she'd glance toward the barn where he'd left the door propped open to air out the hay. No need for more than that. Each noticed the other's care in small, unguarded ways. She saw it in the way he brought in firewood without her asking, stacking it neat so she wouldn't have to fetch it later. He saw it when she patched a tear in his shirt sleeve without making a show of it, leaving it folded on his chair as though it had never been worn thin in the first place. Their shared meals became the only time the silence between them softened. Not that they spoke much, but every so often, she'd catch him telling her about the year the rains came late, or the time a neighbor's herd broke through the fence, and he spent the better part of a week coaxing them home. She didn't interrupt, just let his voice carry across the table like the slow roll of a creek over stones. At night, the house settled into a kind of peace she hadn't known in years. There was no drunken shouting from the street, No sudden knocks at the door. No sharp words waiting to catch her off guard. Just the low crackle of the fire, the creak of the rocker as he read in the corner, and the sound of wind moving through the trees outside. She'd sit with her sewing, the thread pulling smooth through cloth, her mind easing into the quiet, as if it were a warm quilt. It struck her one evening, while she stood at the sink rinsing the supper dishes, that they'd managed to build something without saying they were building it. They hadn't talked about trust, but it was there, woven into the way they left the door unlatched during the day, or the way she knew he'd fix the hinge on the shed without her asking. They hadn't talked about staying, but the idea had begun to root itself deep inside her, as if her boots were learning the shape of this ground. The boundaries were unspoken, but they weren't walls. They were more like fences that marked where the other could come and go freely without trespass. And over time, she began to see that silence wasn't an absence here. It was its own kind of language, a way of saying, "I see you. I know you're here. That's enough." And maybe, she thought as she set the last plate to dry, that was more than she'd ever been offered anywhere else. By late summer, the air in Hollow Bend carried that heavy electric stillness that comes before a storm. The sky turned the color of tarnished silver, clouds rolling low enough to snag on the tops of the cottonwoods. Out by the barn, Thomas stood with his hands on his hips, looking up at the roof like a man deciding whether to fight or surrender. Margaret came to stand beside him, her skirts brushing against the tall grass. The shingles along the southern edge had loosened in the wind, and if the rain came as hard as it promised, the hay inside wouldn't see morning dry. They didn't discuss it. They just went to work. Thomas fetched the ladder, and Margaret gathered what nails and tools she could carry. The first distant rumble shook through the ground, deep and low, and by the time they were both up on the roof, the wind had picked up, tossing the edge of her bonnet like it had a mind to steal it. She tied it tighter under her chin and kept steady on the boards, refusing to be the reason they'd have to climb down twice. Working up there with him was different than sharing a table or passing in the yard. There was no quiet to hide in, just the clatter of hammers, the scrape of shingles, and the way they had to keep shifting close to pass tools between them. She noticed how his shoulders worked under the thin cotton of his shirt, the steady rhythm of his movements. He noticed, though he'd never say that she was sure-footed, unbothered by the height, and quicker with a nail than some ranch hands he'd hired years back. Halfway through, the clouds split open with a crack of thunder that rolled so long it seemed to circle the valley. Thomas reached for a shingle, but his glove caught on the nail bag. The hammer he'd been holding slipped from his grip, skidding toward the roof's edge. Margaret caught it just in time, but not without letting out a startled laugh, sharp and bright in the gray air. It surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him. Thomas glanced over, one eyebrow raised, like he was trying to decide if she was laughing at him or with him. She grinned, really grinned, for the first time since stepping off that train. "Thought you were about to send that hammer clear to Kansas," she teased. He shook his head, but there was something softer in his eyes now, something that hadn't been there before. The corners crinkled, and just barely. He smiled, not the polite, passing smile she'd seen when he first offered her a ride, but a real one, warmer than the wind whipping around them. The rain started as they set the last shingle in place, light at first, then steadier, soaking the boards beneath their knees. They climbed down, boots slick against the ladder rungs, and made it to the barn just as the sky opened fully. Inside, the air was thick with the sweet smell of hay and the sharp tang of fresh-cut wood. They stood there a moment, water dripping from their hair and clothes, watching the storm pound against the roof they'd just mended. Margaret felt a strange sort of pride, half for the work they'd done, half for the fact that they'd done it together. She'd worked beside men before, but not like this. Not with the easy trust that grew in silence and proved itself in small, wordless ways. Thomas reached for a rag hanging from a beam, tossed it to her without looking like he'd thought twice about it. "Good work," he said simply. She nodded, wiping her hands, but the words lingered longer than they should have. It was just a roof, just a storm. But something had shifted, and when the thunder rolled again, it didn't sound quite so far away. The road home from town had a way of stretching out in the dark, the mule's steady steps marking time like a slow heartbeat. Thomas Cowan kept his eyes ahead, the reins loose in his hands, the wagon creaking under the weight of simple necessities: flour, lamp oil, nails, nothing more than what the week called for. His shoulders ached from the day, but there was a pull in his chest he didn't name, one that urged the mule just a touch faster toward the ranch. The prairie night was wide and quiet, the stars so sharp they felt like they might cut the sky. When the house finally came into view, his gaze went first, not to the barn, not to the fences, but to that one front window. A faint, steady glow shone through it, low and golden. It wasn't much, just a lamp and a fire, but it stopped him cold in the yard. That light hadn't been there before Margaret came. For years, the place at night had been black as a cave, holding its breath, waiting for nothing. Now, it was like the house had its own heartbeat. He stepped inside and let the smell of wood smoke wrap around him. The door shut soft behind him. There she was, Margaret curled in the old rocking chair like it had been built for her, head tilted, her sewing resting forgotten in her lap. The fire painted her face in a warm, shifting light. She looked like she'd meant to finish whatever she was stitching, but had been claimed by the kind of sleep you don't fight. Deep, unguarded, safe. He stood there a moment longer than he meant to. Weeks ago, she wouldn't have let herself drift off like this, not in someone else's home. She'd have kept her back straight, her eyes sharp, as though still ready to be sent packing. She'd been a woman braced for the door to open and the floor to fall away. But tonight, she was here, not just in his home, but in it. Moving quietly, he crossed to the sofa and took the quilt from its usual place. The fabric was soft from years of wear, patched here and there, faintly scented with cedar. He unfolded it slow, the way you do when you don't want to wake someone, and laid it over her shoulders. It settled around her like a promise, warm, sure, steady. She didn't stir, didn't open her eyes, but there was a small shift in the way her breath came, in the looseness of her hands against the cloth in her lap. It was the kind of change most folks wouldn't notice, but he did. He saw the moment her body recognized she was covered, protected. Thomas stood there, his hands still holding the edges of the quilt, for a second longer than needed. Trust, he thought, didn't announce itself. It didn't come in a grand gesture or with spoken vows. It slipped in quiet, the way the last light fades at sunset, until one day you realize the whole room has changed. He added a log to the fire and watched the flames catch. The clock on the mantel ticked in the background, the same steady sound it had made for years. Once, it had been the loneliest sound in the world, marking out the slow crawl of empty nights. Tonight, it kept time with something different, something warmer, a rhythm that had begun to settle into the bones of the house. He let his gaze go back to her. In the firelight, she didn't look like the woman he'd found standing stiff and uncertain at the depot weeks ago. That woman had been all sharp edges and watchful eyes, keeping her story to herself. The woman in his chair looked at ease. She'd put her guard down enough to fall asleep with a needle still threaded in her lap. Outside, the wind rattled the eaves, but inside, there was nothing sharp in the air. Just the slow, steady breathing of two people learning how to share the same space without forcing it. He didn't wake her. Didn't want to. He simply let the moment be what it was, quiet, ordinary, and more valuable than either of them could probably say. He knew she might never hear about this small act, might never know how careful he'd been in placing the quilt, but that wasn't the point. Some gestures were meant to be felt, not explained. And he had a feeling she'd feel this one, even in dreams. In the weeks ahead, they'd go back to their quiet ways, he out on the fences, she in the garden or at the stove. Meals would still be eaten mostly in silence, broken only by the sound of a spoon against a bowl or the scrape of a chair. But something in the silence had shifted. It wasn't the silence of strangers anymore. That night, as the fire burned lower, Thomas sat in the other chair, boots unlaced, letting the warmth seep into his bones. He didn't try to name what was happening in the space between them. Some things didn't need naming. They just needed time, the same way a seed needs earth and water before it dares to push up toward the sun. For the first time in years, he didn't mind the sound of the clock ticking. It no longer counted the minutes until sleep would come, but marked the moments of a house slowly filling with something worth keeping. And as he leaned back and let the firelight blur, he thought, without surprise, that he wouldn't trade that quiet for anything. The day was bright enough to fool anyone into thinking it was gentler than it was. The breeze carried that faint, sharp smell of drying grass, the kind that whispered of seasons shifting, whether you were ready or not. Thomas was out by the fence line when the neighbor rode up, a man older than him by a decade, with a hat pulled low and a face carved deep by both sun and sorrow. They exchanged the sort of nod that didn't promise friendship, just acknowledgement. Folks in Hollow Bend knew each other's histories, whether they wanted to or not, and this man carried his own with a heaviness that seemed to bow his shoulders. Thomas leaned his arm on the fence post, letting the quiet sit between them until the neighbor finally spoke. "Heard you've got a woman at your place now," he said, his tone not outright accusing, but with the edge of someone already holding a verdict. "Don't know if you've been told, but folks are talking." The man's eyes flicked away as if he didn't care to watch the words land. "Best be careful. Sometimes trouble looks like company." It wasn't much, just a sentence dressed up as neighborly concern, but it carried the weight of old grief and stale rumors. Margaret, standing in the garden just beyond earshot, might have missed most of it, but she didn't. She caught enough the word trouble, the way the man's voice dipped when he said, "woman." It settled heavy in her chest, not because it was the first time she'd felt the weight of judgment, but because she'd hoped, maybe foolishly, that here would be different. She kept her hands busy among the bean plants, though her ears stayed tuned to the low murmur of men's voices. The neighbor said something else quieter, meant for Thomas alone, but she didn't need to hear it to feel its shape. Every woman who'd ever been whispered about could guess the words. When the neighbor rode off, Thomas didn't come straight to the house. He stayed by the fence, checking a post that didn't need checking, watching the mule cart disappear into the horizon. His face was unreadable, but his hands flexed once at his sides, as if holding back a sharper response than he'd given. Margaret didn't bring it up over supper. They ate in the same quiet they always did, the sound of forks against tin plates filling the space where talk might have been. She half expected him to leave it that way, just another thing to be swallowed down and left unspoken. But when the dishes were done and the lamps turned low, he found her by the fire. "You're welcome here," he said, the words plain and without ceremony, as if they'd been waiting on his tongue all day. He didn't tack on a "no matter what they say" or a "don't listen to them," but she heard those things anyway, tucked between the syllables. She looked at him, searching for the flicker of obligation, but found none. His gaze held steady, not pressing her to respond, not asking for gratitude. It was the kind of assurance that didn't demand to be believed. It just was. And in a life where welcome had often been temporary or conditional, those 3 words rooted deeper than he could have known. Later, when she lay in the small bedroom with the quilt pulled up to her chin, she thought about the neighbor's voice, about the way gossip could take root in a place like Hollow Bend. She'd lived through worse than talk. But what stayed with her wasn't the sting of judgment. It was the quiet weight of Thomas's voice, the way it settled over her like that same quilt, unspoken promise stitched into every thread. The next morning, she rose before him, stoking the fire and setting coffee to boil. The sun came up slow over the prairie, spilling gold over the worn wood of the table. She set out 2 mugs, listening for his boots on the floorboards, and realized that for the first time in longer than she could name, she wasn't bracing for the day to prove her unwelcome. Trust didn't erase the shadows from the past. But here, in this house where a man could say 3 words and mean them, it began to lay its own foundation, quiet, sturdy, and meant to last. The first frost had not yet touched the grass when the barn door rattled open to the kind of cold that makes breath rise like smoke. Margaret was already up, apron tied tight, her hands warmed by a mug of coffee, when she heard Thomas's boots on the porch. The way he stepped inside told her something was wrong. Quiet urgency. No wasted motion. "Cow's birthing early," he said, his voice low but clipped with concern. She didn't hesitate. The mug went down, the apron came off, and they were out the door together, boots crunching on frozen dirt. The barn was dim, the smell of hay and damp animal heavy in the air. The mother cow was down, her breath loud and labored, steam rising from her flank. Margaret's mind moved faster than her fingers as she rolled her sleeves up past her elbows. She had seen births before, back when her father still kept a small herd, but never in weather this raw, never with the stakes so heavy in another person's livelihood. "Tell me what to do," she said, her voice steady. Thomas handed her a length of clean cloth, already moving to check the calf's position. His calm wasn't the kind born of ease. It was the kind learned from years of having no choice but to keep going. For the next hour, they worked shoulder to shoulder. The cold bit through their clothes, their fingers stiffening, but neither spoke of stopping. Margaret's palms burned from pulling, her knees sore from the packed dirt floor. Yet she felt none of it in the moment. The world had shrunk to the barn, the cow, the calf, and the sound of Thomas's voice giving short, clear directions. When the calf finally slid free, limp and slick, she felt a sharp fear twist in her chest. But Thomas was already moving, clearing its nose and mouth, rubbing it down with quick, rough hands. "Come on now," he muttered, more to himself than to the animal. Margaret joined in, drying the calf, feeling the tremor of life begin to stir under her touch. Then came the sound, small, raw, but alive. A weak bleat, the calf's first cry. Margaret sat back on her heels, breath catching in relief, her face breaking into a smile she hadn't planned on. Thomas didn't smile exactly, but the tightness around his eyes eased. The mother cow was already shifting, turning toward her calf. "She's got her," Thomas said, his voice quieter now, the edge of urgency gone. They stayed a while longer, making sure both were steady. Margaret's hands were raw and reddened, bits of straw clinging to her hair, but she didn't mind. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt so anchored to a moment. There was no room for thinking about the past or worrying about the future, only the simple, urgent work in front of her. She glanced at Thomas, noticing the frost in his beard, the way his breath came slow now, measured. He caught her looking and gave a small nod. "You did good," he said, not a compliment tossed off to fill space, but a truth he meant. When they finally stepped back into the yard, the sky was turning that pale blue that comes just before sunrise. The cold hit them full again, but Margaret didn't shiver. They walked side by side toward the house, their boots leaving twin lines in the frost. Neither spoke, and it wasn't the silence of strangers anymore. It was the quiet, after work, well done, when words are less important than the knowing. Inside, Margaret stoked the fire while Thomas put the kettle on. She could feel the stiffness settling into her muscles, but there was a deep, satisfying weight in her bones too. When he handed her a steaming mug of coffee, their fingers brushed for the briefest second. It was nothing anyone else would notice, but it was enough to remind her of the way his shoulder had pressed against hers in the barn, of the trust in moving together without hesitation. That morning, they ate at the table with the easy silence of people who had already shared something that mattered. Outside, the sun climbed higher, melting the frost. Inside, the clock ticked steadily on the wall, marking the rhythm of a house that felt just a little fuller. Margaret thought about how quickly a moment can turn into a memory you know you'll carry. How something as simple as saving a calf could root itself so deep that it changes the way you see a person. And maybe, she thought, the way they see you. Later that day, she found herself looking toward the barn more than once, not out of worry, but with the faint pull of pride. The partnership had been unspoken until then. She cooked, cleaned, tended the garden. He worked the fences, rode the range, but now there was proof in the air between them that they could meet the hard things together. She didn't need to name it. She just knew. And in that knowing, there was a quiet shift. Margaret realized that maybe she hadn't just accepted a ride to his ranch weeks ago. Maybe she had stepped into a life that could hold her. Not because of grand gestures or promises, but because of moments like this one, born in the cold, carried in silence, and warmed by the steady presence of someone who saw her not as a guest, not as a burden, but as part of the work, part of the place, part of the day. The first real cold settled over Hollow Bend without fanfare, just a slow creep of frost along the eaves and a stillness in the mornings that seemed to hush even the birds. By the time winter took full hold, the days had drawn themselves short, and the nights stretched on like a slow song. In that long, unhurried dark, Thomas and Margaret found themselves moving through each day with the same rhythm, each moment stitched to the next, until neither could quite remember when the quiet between them had become something warmer. It started with small, practical tasks that made sense to share when the wind howled against the windows. She'd sit at the table by the fire, a basket of mending at her side, the lamplight pooling across her lap. He'd bring in a harness or bridle from the barn, set himself by the hearth, and work the leather with sure, methodical hands. The sound of a needle pulling through cloth mixed with the low creak of leather under his grip. They didn't speak much, not because there was nothing to say, but because the work itself was its own kind of conversation. Some evenings, she'd read aloud from one of the few books on the shelf. Her voice, steady and low, would carry over the hiss of the fire. Thomas never asked her to read, but he'd lean back in his chair, eyes half on the page, and half on the flames, as if the words were meant for both places at once. She noticed the way his expression changed. Not a smile, not quite, but a softening, like snow settling over the hard ground. Other nights, it was him who kept the fire high, feeding it slow so the heat reached every corner. She'd catch him glancing toward her chair to be sure the light was still warm on her shoulders. If she dozed there, head tilted back, he'd nudge the quilt higher without a word. She never stirred to thank him, but she always knew. The cold made the house a smaller world, and in that closeness, their lives threaded together without ceremony. Morning coffee became a shared ritual. He poured hers without asking. She set his plate down without looking. If a hinge squeaked, he was already reaching for the oil before she mentioned it. If the bread ran low, she had dough rising before he noticed the jar was nearly empty. There were still silences, but they had changed. In the beginning, their quiet had been careful, like strangers passing on a narrow road. Now it had weight and comfort, the way the earth feels steady beneath you after a long ride. She didn't need to fill it, and neither did he. One bitter night, when wind rattled the shutters hard enough to wake them both, they ended up in the kitchen at the same time. She was checking the larder, making sure nothing near the wall would freeze. He was stoking the stove to keep the pipes from icing. They worked side by side without speaking, each knowing exactly what the other was doing and why. When they were done, they lingered a moment longer, watching the fire in the stove until it steadied. It was in moments like that, the kind with no words, no plans, that she realized they had become part of each other's daily certainty. He was the figure she expected to see crossing the yard at dusk, shoulders hunched against the wind. She was the sound of footsteps he knew would follow in from the garden with the day's last vegetables in hand. There were no declarations, no deliberate turning points. Just the slow, steady way winter settles in, quiet, sure, impossible to mark on a single day. The house, once full of edges and spaces between them, now felt whole. Her sewing basket stayed near the fire. His tools found a place by the door, and the smell of fresh bread or saddle oil lingered in the air most days. Sometimes, when she read, he'd lift his eyes from the harness and watch her, though she pretended not to notice. Sometimes, when he stood from his chair, she'd find herself listening for the sound of his boots crossing the room, knowing exactly where he'd pause, where he'd turn, as if the shape of his movements had become as familiar as the shape of the rooms themselves. By the time the first thaw crept in under the eaves, it would be hard for either of them to say when it had begun, the shift from sharing a roof to sharing a life. But there it was, quiet and certain, woven into the fabric of every day. And maybe that's the way some things are meant to happen. Not with fanfare, not with sudden changes, but in the slow accumulation of small acts, each one stacking on the last until you look up and realize you've built something without even meaning to. If you've ever had that, if you've ever looked across a room and realized the person there has quietly become part of the rhythm of your life, then you understand. And if you haven't, well, maybe stories like this are here to remind us it's possible. If you've been listening, and this piece of their winter has warmed something in you, don't just let it pass by. Like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and follow the channel so you can be here when the next part unfolds. Because sometimes the quietest chapters are the ones worth holding on to the most. Spring came quiet, the way it always does out here, first with a change in the light, then with the stubborn green pushing through last year's dead grass. The air softened, smelled of rain before it came, and the nights no longer bit so hard. On mornings when the sun came up clean over the horizon, Margaret would stand at the kitchen window, hands wrapped around her coffee cup, and watch the frost pull back from the fence posts. It was the sort of slow renewal you only noticed if you'd been still long enough to see the change. By then, the ranch itself had taken on a different feel. The barn roof held tight where winter storms had once rattled it loose. The corral posts stood straight, mended and strong. Even the garden bare for months showed neat rows where she'd already pressed seeds into the earth. You could almost say the place looked tended from the inside out, as though the house and land had caught whatever quiet steadiness had settled between them. Thomas leaned against the corral one afternoon, sleeves rolled, hat tipped back just enough to let the wind pass his face. He wasn't a man for speeches, but you could see he had something on his mind. Margaret was beside him, one boot hooked on the lower rail, eyes following the horses as they moved slow in the pen. Neither of them seemed in a hurry to speak. Sometimes the weight of a thing takes its time before it decides to fall. When he did speak, it was the plainest thing in the world. You could stay, not because you have to, because you want to. He didn't dress it up, didn't try to make it sound like more than it was. But that was Thomas's way, no frills, no performance. Just the truth, steady as fence wire. Margaret turned to look at him, and it wasn't the offer that caught her, it was the way he said it. Like he'd already decided she belonged but wanted her to be the one to name it. She held his gaze for a moment, the wind teasing a strand of hair loose across her cheek. Then she nodded, slow, certain. All right. No handshake, no embrace, no promise sealed under a sunset. Just a nod and a soft smile that said more than words could carry. The prairie wind picked up just then, catching the brim of her hat, tugging at the hem of her skirt. If there was any other answer between them, it got carried off with the dust. It's funny, the way big moments can feel so quiet when they finally happen. No one else was there to see it. No neighbors would gossip about it over coffee. No family would write to congratulate them. But that was the beauty of it. It wasn't for anyone else to witness. Just two people who had learned each other's silences, deciding to keep them in the same house. Over the next weeks, life went on much as before. He worked the cattle, fixed the gates, kept the tools sharp. She cooked, planted, mended, kept the place warm. Only now, there was no question of how long. The shape of their days wasn't temporary anymore, and you could feel that difference in the way they moved, less careful, more at ease. And maybe that's what this story has been about all along. Not grand gestures, not wild declarations, but the slow work of building something steady. A life. A place where two people can wake up each morning and know they're exactly where they're meant to be, not because fate pushed them there, but because they chose it. You can take that lesson any way you like. Maybe it's about patience, or maybe it's about paying attention when the quiet between you changes from space to comfort. Maybe it's about letting go of what you thought your life had to look like and seeing what's right in front of you. Whatever it is, it's worth holding on to. Because the truth is, we don't always get fireworks when our life changes. Sometimes it's just the sound of boots on dirt, and someone saying, "You could stay." And you realize you've been home for a while now, you just hadn't said it out loud. If you've been following their story, you know this wasn't about rescuing or saving. It was about meeting in the middle, about seeing the worth in each other without trying to turn it into something it's not. That's the kind of love that lasts out here, under all this sky-steady, weatherproof, and rooted deep enough to hold through whatever comes next. So, if this story sat with you, If it reminded you of something you've lived or something you hope for, don't let it drift away like that prairie wind. Tap that like button, drop a comment telling me what part stuck with you most, and follow the channel so you don't miss the next story. Because out here, every season has a tale worth telling, and sometimes the quiet endings are just the start of the next chapter.